Rock music appears to have stirred hate and fear in the hearts and minds of some parents, and as the volume of this controversy is cranked up, shock and roll becomes the talk of the town.
Hi everybody, it's Mike here from The Art of Guitar. You know, when you look back on your life, sometimes you realize that you lived through some crazy stuff. And I was reminded of the whole Satanic Panic era last week when I saw Poison's Open Up and Say Ah, the original cover. And my sister was a huge Poison fan, so she was all excited about this album to come out. And at first, it looked like this. And it was a little bit unsettling at the time, but, you know, I thought it was pretty cool. I guess some parent groups made a huge fuss about it. They thought it was real demonic looking, and so Walmart refused to sell it. So I guess that's why they ended up censoring the cover to look like this. I really wish I would have picked up the vinyl back then of the uncensored version, because I think it goes for like $600 to $800 now. At least that's what I saw online the other day. Well, if you ask any older person about that whole era, they probably all remember it and have a story or two about it, because man, they were really pushing it at the time, and it affected us all differently, I believe. So I took it really personal. I think it's because of just my circumstances. You know, when I was a kid, my dad used to take us to church every Sunday, and then out of nowhere, he just stopped going. He's like, "We're not going to church anymore." And so that was the end of that. Not too long after that, though, I ended up seeing the movie The Exorcist on TV. And I was only 7 or 8 years old. And so that was traumatizing to me. And I think my brain got rewired that night. I didn't want to go to sleep because I was afraid that my bed would start shaking. I thought I would wake up possessed. I kept seeing that scary face that's in the movie every time I closed my eyes. So it was such a nightmare. I didn't know what to do. You know, I would try to talk to my mom about it, and she would just be like, "Oh, that's stupid. It's not real." But to me, it was real. And so the only thing I could think to do was to steal my dad's Bible off of his bookshelf and try to read it. I thought that would protect me. That would like save my soul. It did help me feel a little bit better. But, you know, a little while after that, my cousin came over with a record in his hand, and he was always introducing me to really cool music. He got me into Kiss. He got me into Purple Rain back in the day. And so I was really curious to what he was holding. And it ended up being Shout at the Devil by Motley Crue. So here's us three young kids sitting around a record player listening to the intro, which is called In the Beginning. And it is terrifying.
So come now, children of the beast, be strong.
You might ask, you know, but weren't you into Kiss already? Why was this scary to you? Well, Kiss was never scary to me. They were always like, you know, cool and fun, exciting. I thought of them more like comic book characters, you know? I guess you could say that Kiss would shout it out loud. They wouldn't shout at the devil. Sorry, that sounded way more clever when I was writing it. So we're listening to that intro. We're all freaked out. Then it kicks into Shout at the Devil, which is such a killer tune, you know? But that night on the news, they were doing this quite a bit at the time. They had a newscast talking about the whole Satanic Panic thing. And by the way, this video is not to go in depth with the actual Satanic Panic origins or anything like that. It's really just talking about growing up through that time. But if you want to look into it, it's fascinating. So the newscast was showing, you know, all these kids listening to heavy metal, and then they would show all this scary imagery.
In addition to groups that are blatantly satanic, there are also many recordings which some believe may contain satanic references in the form of backward messages.
And they showed a guy talking about backwards masking, where you would take an album. I think he had Led Zeppelin, and he was playing Stairway to Heaven backwards, and he was saying, "See, they're talking about Lucifer and stuff."
Okay, the phrase we're looking for is, and there's still time to change the road you're on it.
Now flip it for us.
Okay. A lot of people hear the phrase, "My sweet Satan." Can you hear it?
My sweet Satan.
And so my cousin, you know, he was a wild kid. He had the idea of taking the Motley Crue album and playing it backwards. And he put it in, started playing it backwards with that first song In the Beginning. And I thought it was creepy forward, but backwards, it was like 1,000 times scarier. And I could swear I was hearing all these words coming out. You know how your mind can play tricks on you sometimes? I thought it said Bucifer once. I thought that's pretty close to Lucifer. But I thought I was tainted. You know, I thought, oh no, I held the album. I listened to it forward and backwards. The chances of me getting possessed are a lot higher now. And at the time, we thought the news was like gospel, you know, pardon the pun. We thought everything that the talking heads were saying on that screen were true. So we bought into it all the way. Here we were, 3 young kids, freaked out of our minds. We went to bed, got up the next day, and we had sort of a group meeting. It was kind of weird. And we were like, what should we do? Because we all felt like we were in some sort of danger. It was really strange. So after watching Muppet Babies to feel a little bit better, we decided, this is weird, everyone I tell this to, they look at me really strange, but we decided to get chalk, go around the neighborhood and actually draw crosses on things. So, you know, sides of buildings on the bricks, we'd go up to like street signs and put a cross, nothing too crazy. But I did go into a Hardee's and there was a bar of soap. This is back when they had bars of soap at restaurants. And I took it and I drew a cross on the mirror. And underneath it, we would put these letters WWC and WLC. We thought, okay, that means we worship Christ and we love Christ. We were just trying to do anything to try to save our souls at this time. We felt a little bit better, but a fear still stayed with me at least, long after the rain washed away those chalk crosses. Right around that time, my mom met my future stepdad, and he was a cool guy. He rode a Harley. He just got out of the Marines, so he was a pretty wild dude. And he told us that he once saw Ozzy Osbourne live. And in my brain, I thought, okay, Ozzy is this really demonic guy. You know, I was afraid of him. And I asked my stepdad, I'm like, you know, isn't he like super satanic? And didn't he bite the head off of a bat one time in concert? And my stepdad kind of laughed it off, you know, and he was just like, yeah, I think he bit a bat, but he thought it was a fake bat. And actually the concert that I saw, Ozzy opened these cages and let these doves fly free and just wished world peace to everybody. I was so confused because I believed the news so much, like I said, that I didn't know who was telling me the truth. One of the big reasons I was so afraid of Ozzy was because in the newscast, they showed a bunch of album covers, and one of them was for Ozzy's Diary of a Madman. And I thought he looked like The Exorcist, or the girl in The Exorcist, Linda Blair, on that cover. So that freaked me out. And then I saw the Bark at the Moon cover as well, and the video, and I was just a goner, you know? So a few years go by and a few more after school specials scaring us even more. They were just really good at scaring us back then. Well, I had a new best friend and his older brother had a whole bunch of rock and heavy metal cassettes. You know, he had like Wasp and Judas Priest and Motley Crue and bands like that. Well, once again, I felt that push and pull because I was curious about them and I would listen to some and I thought that sounds awesome. But then I would quickly think of the other side and all the fear mongering that they pushed on us. And right about that time, they had this whole thing called the PMRC starting up. It was the Parents Music Resource Center. And it was started, I guess, by Tipper Gore, who is Al Gore's wife. Pardon the pun, but that should have tipped me off having someone named Tipper telling you what to listen to. And so the fear got ramped up again. They were saying stuff like, you know, the band Wasp stands for We Are Satan's People. KISS stands for Knights in Satan's Service or Kings in Satan's Service. And there was just all these weird rumors going around. And we couldn't check anything because there was no internet at the time. So we just had to either believe it or not. A short time after that, I started noticing more and more kids wearing black t-shirts to school, you know, with metal bands on them. Some of them were deemed too extreme for school. So they had to usually turn them inside out. Or this shirt, you know, I'm wearing right now, the Metallica Metal Up Your Ass shirt. I actually had to take tape and put it over the word ass. I did a whole video on this, by the way. I'll put the link below, but because that was, you know, thought of as too profane for school. You know, the knife sticking up out of the toilet was okay, but not the word ass. And then another weird thing started happening. These other kids who were from a church group, I believe, they started wearing shirts that were like the opposite of the metal shirts. They were like parodies. So instead of a Megadeth shirt, somebody came in with a Mega Life shirt. And then instead of Slayer, they had Prayer with the same, you know, logo and everything. Well, I found myself starting to go more towards the metal side of things, you know? I'm like, I don't feel like I belong with these other people. They seemed kind of boring to me, you know? Like the curious side of me, the rebellious side of me was more interested in the people wearing the metal shirts at the time. And I believe this is around the time they started putting warning labels on albums. So you'd go to the store and there'd be these parental advisory stickers on certain albums. They kind of backfired a little bit because they're supposed to keep kids away from those albums, but it actually told us which ones we should get. The young me that was really scared and drawing crosses on Hardee's bathroom mirrors was suddenly curious about what all this was about. There was just something about these square politicians telling us what to listen to that kind of just pushed us the other way. I also saw footage of Dee Snider from Twisted Sister. I think he was testifying in Congress, and here he was with his, you know, long blonde hair, and all these other people are in suits, you know, in the government, and he's speaking truth. You know, he had such conviction, and what he was saying was making a lot of sense, even to my young mind back then.
Mr. Snyder, what is the name of your fan club? The fan club is called the SMF Friends of Twisted Sister.
And what does SMF stand for when it's spelled out?
It stands for the Sick Motherfucking Friends of Twisted Sister.
Is this also a Christian group?
I don't believe that profanity has anything to do with Christianity.
Now, keep in mind that there's always levels to this stuff. So just because I went the heavy metal route, you know, the black shirt, t-shirt route, doesn't mean I went as extreme as some people. You know, I was more into the Metallicas, the Megadeth, Testament, Anthrax, those kind of bands. But there were people that were into, you know, Deicide, Cannibal Corpse, all those kind of groups. So those were a lot more extreme than what we were doing. You did have the in-between bands like Slayer and Sepultura, but as far as just the kind of music we loved the more, or I guess less threatening thrash metal. As I got older, I ended up forming a metal band, and we were in that thrash vein, but we did play with a lot of bands that were super extreme. Like one time we played this Metal Massacre, and the band that went on before us had crosses on stage covered in goat entrails, I believe. I was like, how do you even get those? Do you go to the grocery store and go to the butcher's section and ask for a bucket of guts? I had no idea. And you know, I learned a lot during those times because you'd hang out backstage, you'd talk to the other musicians, you'd find out we're all just metal fans and we're just out having fun. You know, I don't think I ever met someone who was like a seriously practicing Satanist or anything. Now, the echoes of Satanic Panic actually carried all the way through to when I started teaching guitar. I had these group classes where I would teach rock songs a lot of the times, and we would just, you know, there was, I believe, a Hal Leonard book that had like 8 metal songs in it or rock songs in it. And sometimes parents would get really weird about that book because it had Black Sabbath in it. It had some, you know, other metal bands that were objectionable to a lot of people. So that fear from the Satanic Panic era was still holding on. Well, one time, one of the moms almost pulled her daughter out of the group class because she had taken that songbook home and she was reading all the lyrics. And she's like, you know what? This seems demonic to me. You know, I'm worried about what you're teaching my kids. And then she started reading the lyrics to one of the songs, and I almost busted out laughing because it was the Scorpions song for Rock You Like a Hurricane. And picture me just standing there while a mom's just freaking out, and she's like, okay, listen to what these lyrics say. The bitch is hungry. She needs to tell. So give her inches and feed her well. And she's like, I know what that means. And she kind of had the big crazy eyes, you know. She reminded me a little bit of the lady from Donnie Darko, you know, the lady that wants everyone to burn the books from the library or whatever. I ended up talking her down a little bit. I'm like, she doesn't have to play those songs, you know, she could just play Sweet Child of Mine. Is that okay? And that seemed to be all right with her. Now that I'm older, I look back and I'm like, you know, I understand a parent's concern when you listen to what they're listening to and it just seems crazy. You want to protect your kid, obviously. But there's a line between wanting to protect your kid and, you know, wanting to burn records on the street or something. And that's the kind of energy this lady had. But like every other phase in my life, this eventually fizzled out, at least in the metal world. You know, they weren't really demonizing heavy metal as much anymore. But I find it very ironic that in order for me to get over my fears that were pushed on me so hard at one point, I actually had to get into the very thing they were warning against. It's like, if you're an outsider, it can seem really scary, but once you're on the inside, and like I said, you know the musicians who make the music, you know the intentions of people for the most part, at least in your circles, all of a sudden those fears went away. And I was just like, you know what? They're just not seeing it from a certain perspective. So for something that started in the early 80s, I believe it's because of a book of a girl, I think it's called Michelle Remembers, about a girl remembering all these things that happened to her in the, you know, world of rituals and Satanism and stuff like that. I'm going to do more research on that. I might actually read that book. It's so crazy how that carried over for so many years, you know, all the way into the mid 90s. And I'd be really curious to find out how it affected you. Was it something that was just kind of a passing thing in the background for you, or did it directly, you know, affect you? Were you a musician? Were you a metal fan and your parents wouldn't let you listen to certain things because of all this? So let me know in the comment section and I'll check it out. But everyone, thank you so much for watching this. It was fun. It was kind of weird thinking back to how crazy the times got, but it's always fun to share it with all of you and let you know what it was like to live through it. So thanks again, and we will catch you at the next video. Okay, bye-bye.
Shock and roll becomes the talk of the town.